Hello, and welcome to a second conversation with Martin Shaw. Hi there, Martin.
Hi, Mark. Delighted to see your beautiful face again.
Thank you so much. Now, look, we spoke, a little while ago now, and things were changing for you, and you were starting to talk about that in public. And we're speaking now again after the second of a series of weekends called the Skimboat and the Star that you are hosting down in Devon, and they're very much the sort of the fruition, or at least the sort of product of where you're at with this new development. Now, look, I'm being rather elusive. Things are changing, new developments, and so on. This is the visionary experience that you had, and then the adoption of Orthodox Christianity. And I was at an event which you were giving earlier this week, and there's still quite a sense of how to introduce this new element into the things that people know and love you for, the storytelling, the myth conveying, and so on. How to integrate that Christian sensibility in. And, you said, I said, let's talk about that, because it's not just, I think, a kind of private journey that you're going on. It's one I'm trying to participate in too, and feels like this very unfolding is much to do with what might be going on in broader contexts as well. It's always a bit difficult to know how much of this is just a bubble that one's experiencing with one's own compatriots. But nonetheless, I was actually, funny enough, I was talking to a friend of yours just last night, Dougal Hine, and he called it a cultural eruption. And I said to him,
Mm.
how do you know? That sounds quite a big thing. How do you sense that? And he actually said, well, of course, who would have bet a few years back that you yourself, others, Paul Kingsnorth, of course, who he knows very well, would be becoming, almost go-to commentators on Christian things. So something is happening. That's definitely the so. Um, you're putting on these weekends, the Skimboat and the Star. Things are working out for you, and you're drawing people who are on a similar kind of search and quest into Christianity. Now, look, maybe I should just ask you: is that a fair characterization of things?
I think it absolutely is. As you have attended Skinboat, you will have seen that we will have clerics sitting next to boat makers, sitting next to therapists, sitting next to guys that work on building sites. It's in a very, whatever the echolocation it's sending out, whatever the pulse it's sending out, Um, it seems to work across all sort of stratas of occupation and I guess what we think of as class, really, which is tremendously thrilling for me. It's everything that I could ever hope for, quite honestly. You mentioned something a minute ago, though, that somehow there is still a sense of jeopardy when you announce to the sort of the general public, um, it's, I guess, what you call a deep experience of faith, especially when the ladder you have built is on a wall that doesn't necessarily point to that. So, about 6 months ago, my school, I've had a school of myth and story now for 21 years. It was the last weekend of my previous iteration of teaching. And it had been coming to me for a few days, but I suddenly realized there needed to be something of a line drawn between what I had been doing before and where I now dynamically, creatively, and to use a big word, religiously found myself. But not a line drawn in a sense of what before was fallen and this was glittering and wonderful. It wasn't quite that. But sometimes you do have to state an intention. Goethe, who we both know reasonably well, always says boldness will be rewarded by the universe. There are certain forces that don't really come to your aid until you take a risk. And I certainly took a risk where I said, look, I want to reimagine stories that feel probably rather stultified in our mind. And by that, I mean biblical stories. The image that comes to me, actually, corny though it may seem, is at the very end of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where those animals in Narnia that have been so long frozen are the ruach is blown on them again, and they come out from their crustacean and they're wild things again in their wild nature, disclosing their wild things. And I actually feel like that about a lot of the old stories. The New Testament has an energy entirely of its own. So what I can tell you is, in the immediate response to my declaration 6 months ago was a demand for refunds. So that was the first thing. There was no kind of, clapping. There was people saying, "Okay, God go with you, but I don't necessarily want this journey." And then, remarkably, bit by bit, all the perfect folks started turning up at the same time. You will know that in my local villages around Dartmoor now, we have people that have come from Japan to do the course. We have someone commuting from Australia, bless her, to do the course. We have folks regularly coming over from America to do the course. So it has a sort of an international climate to it, but absolutely beyond my imagining 3 years ago. Yeah.
I mean, let me just add. It's some commitment actually. Financially to cover costs, of course, but also, it's 5 long weekends, and the age range. I think you mentioned there. 20 to 70 plus, I guess, and also pretty equal men and women too. So that's very fascinating in terms of how people try and assess these things.
I'm
Look, so there's a lot. Let's maybe try and tease out one thread at a time, and maybe let's start with the more negative side, which is people asking for refunds, or at least that's a symptom of people asking for of this kind of wariness of Christianity, as you're saying. I've heard you say other times that a particularly painful response came from your friends who have connections with indigenous communities in one way or another. A key source of a lot of the stories that you tell, or key holders, I should say, of a lot of the stories that you tell. And, the completely understandable reaction that Christianity has been the holder of so much that has oppressed those communities and traditions in recent centuries, and finding it very hard to see beyond that. And I think, Christianity does have that feel for a lot of people, that which it stands for that's objectionable. And it might be sort of soft objection, like it's associated vaguely with guilt or with kind of conformity, that kind of low level sort of objection, through to the stronger conjecture that, a kind of theology of dominance and exceptionalism and so on has shaped so much of what's come out of Christian countries in the West, at least. These are powerful memories and feelings that people have. I think there's a way of trying to feel into that a bit more, which I've had some experience of myself actually. But is that the sort of sense that you have that people find troubling about Christianity?
Yes, exactly. And it's things that I would have found troubling about Christianity had I not gone through a series of experiences that rather exploded that. No, from a distance, it looks, I think, like a rather fatigued religion that has rather forgotten what it is. And on the one hand, you have, what I could only describe as rabid fundamentalists. And on the other, you have people that are so desperate to appeal to modernity, they are dissembling Noah's Ark at such speed, I don't think it'll ever be able to be reconstructed. So people see both of those elements and are deeply unattracted to it. Why put yourself through that when you can go and sit on a mountain and have a wonderful feeling? Why put yourself through that when you can camp by a river and no one is necessarily whacking a creed or a doctrine on your head? People are still open to spiritual encounter, but I think they are wary and fatigued by religious doctrine, quite honestly. I certainly was. That does not mean, though, that people are not seeking a deeper life. I think intrinsically most of us are, and I think that was the conclusion many of us came to through lockdown. But yes, my take I think, on Western Christianity predominantly would have been, it was this rather encrusted, calcified, dying, Dover beached, distant shored thing that was departing. Whereas the vitality of Tibetan Buddhism, of Dzogchen, of Sufism, of Aboriginal, indigenous ideas coming from all over the world, that was what galvanized me. That was where the action was. Why on earth would you want to sit in a sort of a dusty old church with all the, with lots of bearded men making you feel bad about yourself? I am profoundly understanding of that point of view. Yeah.
Well, here's two bearded men trying to feel into that and see whether there's other threads to follow. The conversation that I recall, I haven't nearly got the experience that you have, but I have had some conversations with a friend, Melissa Nelson, who's at Arizona State University and is an indigenous community leader, but also works on these things in a kind of academic context. And where I felt sort of reconnection starting to be made was the word that it all hangs on actually is participation, which is a word that has a huge resonance for me because I get it from Owen Barfield. You mentioned C.S. Lewis, this great friend of C.S. Lewis. And for Barfield, participation was the word that he used to capture how our consciousness resonates with other consciousnesses. And of course, not just other human consciousnesses, but also what he called the inside of the whole world. The kind of intelligent, dynamic, interactive ecologies that we're embedded in and immersed in and have a particular part to play in. That way we participate with the wider world. And when I was able to try and bring into the conversation something that Christianity has understood about that, but I think has got very marginalized in the modern period, that felt like a moment when both we could start having a conversation that wasn't just about considering the ills of recent years, but was maybe about finding a path to nudge forward into a new sense of communication and connection, which is, both good for the conversation, but it's also, I think, good for Christianity. There's a sense in which that idea that this deeper life, which is partly vertical, which we'll come to, about relationship with God, but is a lot horizontal as well, about how we can re-relate to the world around us. Not pressed just by the sense of crisis, which of course is powerfully felt by many people, but is really led by a kind of vitality, that it's possible to experience life not as isolated consciousnesses stuck in solo skulls trying to reach out to other solo skulls, which is the very widespread and dominant view of things like inner experience, that's written into a lot of assumptions, and that the scientists, the neuroscientists, make as much as anyone else. But that to feel one as self as sharing in a sort of field of consciousness that one has a particular relationship to because of one's individuality, but that being aware of drawing from that field and then offering back to that field, so that connection is the fundamental assumption, not isolation that's trying to be broached. And then, of course, you've got what you need to try and relate in that participative way, which brings one back to the stories, but also, as you've been talking about recently as well, the great saints who often have relationships to animals, who have important relationships to place, to trees, and so on. Participation, anyway, as a sort of way of trying to find a new conversation going forward.
Yes, perfect. Participation mystique, as the anthropologists used to say. Yes, that this is a relational universe, something that a Lakota Sioux medicine man and an Irish bard would have in common is they would believe that the words you spoke had such vitality attached to them. You could change consciousness around you. In the beginning was the word, it's a powerful thing. And when you are sort of no longer in contact with the velocity of language in that way, the world becomes a more darkened globe. C.S. Lewis used to write about how in the medieval era, if you looked up into the sky, you would see your inner life reflected in the life of the stars. So things were continually being mirrored and threaded back to you. This was a connected and related universe. I think one of the problems that, again, from a distance, Christianity can seem to create is this notion, of the rapture, of there's this place beyond this world. Well, that's fine and dandy, but most of us have had, superficially at least, we don't seem to have had much contact with it, but we have had contact with herons and cormorants and deserts and ice flows. That's the stuff we love. For me, when people talk about heaven, to be honest, it's a knock at the door and all my best friends arriving and the fire is lit and the wine is uncorked and somebody's bought something to eat. And for my little heart, that's as great as I can possibly imagine. However, I wrote recently, I was finishing a book and I wrote this line that has proved meaningful for me. And I think I shared it with you the other day. In each experience of beauty, we are being prepared for eternity. And that is the distillation in one bloody sentence of a lifetime of my work. And it's why I feel that beauty is important. Now, what beauty is, that's an entirely longer conversation. But we know when we've been claimed by beauty because it changes the way we react. As I've said before, reverie, in my opinion, should lead to participation, not to lethargy. But when I was a kid, and probably rather off-put by the Christian message, it seemed that the things of this world, the really beautiful things, in other words, God's delight in what he created seemed muted in comparison because of the fall with this wonderful thing that was coming. But this wonderful thing that was coming, this life after death, that remains conceptual for most of us. It is an idea. It's an idea. But when you start to regard encounters of profundity and beauty during our lived experience as foreshadowings of that then something starts to dwell and to grow in me. And I move out of what you've just highlighted, which is really in the last 150 years, the sort of the dark side of individuation that's been growing up in the West. Jung, of course, highlighted this. And in a way, Jesus's attention to the inner kingdom is, he's referring to this, but in a participatory sense, rather than an isolated existential one.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And another great Christian mystic writer, Dante, when he writes in the Divine Comedy, actually, I think it was C.S. Lewis that really made a lot of this, was that the higher, as it were, Dante travels with Beatrice in paradise, the weightier the metaphors come. I think Lewis called it the weight of glory. And Lewis actually even tracked the metaphors that Dante uses across the last 15 or so cantos of the Paradise, so this is in the Imperium, in the divine realm. And the metaphors that Dante draws on are more and more tangible, more and more materially, even literally weighty. There's images like mountains being reflected in perfectly still lakes, and Dante not being able to tell where the origin begins and the reflection starts. That sort of meeting point. He sees that the mountain and the image are becoming one and the same gorgeous sight. And this is, a metaphor for the divine source and the creation that's a reflection of that divine light. But he's using a mountain in order to do that, which of course is an experience that we all will have had, to look at a mountain and its reflection, and can know, therefore, in this life, being prepared through that image of beauty for eternity. So that kind of linking, I think, rather than othering of heaven is really important. And some strands of Christianity do struggle with that because of a very heavy doctrine of the fallenness of this world, and that something needs to be put right before this great chasm or abyss between the natural world, human beings, and the divine can be bridged, rather than the more sort of Danteesque view. Or of course, William Blake is famous for it: heaven in a wild flower, world in a grain of sand, eternity in the palm of your hand, and so on. That it's but this participation is fractal. Maybe would be a
Yes.
modern word. It's by attending to the minute particulars that heaven opens up, not by wanting to flee and try and find another place entirely.
Yes, brilliant. Now, a sort of a darker version of the signs and symbols and wonders that are constantly announcing themselves to us. Here's one for you that I've just had. I've just come back from a very short book tour, and part of the book tour involved going to Canterbury, where I lived 30 years ago. And of course, as someone that's very interested in a kind of reimagining of the pilgrimages, I took myself to the gate of Canterbury Cathedral, where I was met by security guards with kind of cash machines saying, you can go no further until you pay us a big bunch of money. And this is not new to Canterbury Cathedral. If you know about Thomas Becket, when Thomas Becket was butchered there, before the body had even been removed, they'd siphoned off his blood, put it in vials filled with water, and for the next 400 years flogged his quote unquote blood until the Reformation put an end to it. So they've always had an eye on the bottom line. But my story doesn't finish there. So my immediate reaction was I was sort of repelled by it, the fact that they were wanting an immediate cash exchange. And of course, I would have donated much more than that, but I wanted some sense of the transformational before we met the transactional. However, so I went off in a bit of a huff and said, well, a pox on your house. And then I thought about my own relationship to Canterbury Cathedral, the fact that I had not slowly traversed the forests of Kent over the best part of a week to get there. I had not risked being bonked over the head by a robber or seduced in one way or another. I turned up with a flat white after a very good night's sleep in a decent hotel, having risked absolutely nothing for this encounter to get there, and then was affronted by the guard. But you see, the guard and I were complicit at that moment. We were complicit. I turned up with nothing, so he demanded, in a way, nothing from me. He didn't want to see if my feet were bare. He didn't want to know about the story. It was just an exchange. This week in New York, my really old friend now, actually, Paul Kingsnorth, was talking, and I haven't seen all of it yet, but one of the premises that he had was that civilization and Christianity are fundamentally and almost always going to be at odds with each other, because the remit of Jesus is actually so radical and so disturbing and so strange, it doesn't lend itself to the comfortable building of a nation state. That's it in a nutshell. And I realized how easy for me it was to slip into a consumer and then be affronted with the guard and his little cash thing. But really, it was a mirror. It was a mirror of how little I had actually invested in that moment. It was, Canterbury Cathedral was little more than a hologram to me at that moment. So to come back to your original idea, you have to be alert to your own endorsement of the photocopy of the thing, not the thing itself. You get this in myths, by the way, in fairy tales. If you have an encounter in the forest, say you're offered something, it could be a golden wreath. When you come back to the village, they will try and create a facsimile of it so you don't set out on the journey. And something I've been aware of in the last 3 years has been trying to stay alert to anything in this experience of Christianity that I'm having that is a false economy, that is actually trying to corral and sedate me and take me further from a Blakean way of beholding the world into just merely the transactional. One of the things I've come back from that experience of Canterbury with is to say this. Let's use England as an example. There is an unexamined England at our feet. There is a Blakean England at our feet. It is 3 yards from your own front door. But as you know very well, it requires a Jobian eye to see it. It isn't the same eye necessarily that you do the accounts with, but that for me is part of the exposure to these stories. It's part of the exposure to my interest in what I've been talking about privately to you, which is a revival of the merry. The saints are wonderful things. The desert is wonderful. The early Christians are wonderful. But as a wilderness guide of 30 years, not everybody's wired for that. For a Christianity to have a real ferment, it can't just be a forested Christianity. It has to be a Christianity of the village as well. There has to be a thread. But, concurring actually a little bit with Paul's talk, and Joseph Campbell said this, the role of the community is to torture the mystic. The role of the community is to torture the mystic. Not always, but you understand what he's saying. There will always be an inevitable tension between what Julian of Norwich is discovering, or Jacobema is discovering, and the kind of skill set required to get on in this world.
Yeah, just in brackets, actually, I've listened to Paul's lecture. It's the Erasmus lecture for people that want to search it, hosted by First Things. It's very typically Paul. There's a strong narrative line there, a strong sense of the imperatives, which of course he's been working out as well over the last 2 or 3 years. I should also just say, as it happens, one of my longest-standing friends is the Dean of Canterbury Cathedral, David Monteith, and this trouble with the that archway and Canterbury Cathedral even has its own police. That's how kind of deeply enculturated that is, and they're trying to work out what to do about that because there's this extraordinary building that costs a fortune to maintain and so on. But the deeper tensions that you're highlighting there are very fascinating, because I remember when David got the job, about 18 months ago, and we went down and he kind of gave us a tour around. And the thing that was overwhelming actually is that this is extraordinarily beautiful building. It's undoubtedly one of the most beautiful buildings in the country. This, English Gothic, which just pulses with this participation actually that we're talking about in stone, and the way that it leads you into a kind of holy of holies up at the east end, and the beautiful curves as well as the arches and the perpendiculars and so on. And saints, and then plants, and then there's the crypt, where Thomas of Becket was killed, that still maintains that sense of holiness. The selling of the blood didn't drain that away, I'm glad to say. So there's all that spiritual power, really, a power of allure. And yet, of course, at the same time, this building was put up to express political power, because the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time was almost as powerful as the king, which of course is what led to Thomas of Becket's trouble. And so that sort of secular power, which was absolutely implicit in its construction, leaves this almost unbearable tension now, because of course that political power is more or less completely drained away. The Archbishop of Canterbury, can make a comment about, I don't know, homelessness or immigration now, and it gets a bit of coverage in the news, but it's not the kind of comment he can make that can overthrow a government, and hooray for that. But how that untangling can take place of what was this extraordinarily strong political power, to leave us with the spiritual brilliance, brightness that building now can speak to. This is part
Yes.
of I suppose, the legacy of a country that's so shaped by Christianity. But Christianity is receding, the long withdrawing roar you mentioned, and that creates both the sort of opportunity as well as these huge troubles. You can want to encounter something Christian and get charged transactionally before you've even tasted the transcendence.
Mm.
But on the other hand, maybe the withdrawing of the political power does expose something of the spiritual allure once again. And perhaps that's a way of characterizing a bit of where we're at. Sometimes people say, what's going on with people like yourself, others who are turning or at least becoming Christian
Mm.
adjacent once again. And I think it may be because precisely there's been a kind of marginalization, if not a complete eclipse of Christianity. And so its beating heart is in a way all that you can see if you do try to look with these different eyes that you're mentioning. And that shows up something in the simplicity of its essence that then can be appealing. So yeah, paradoxically, it's a kind of decline that is perhaps, at least to some, offering the chance to see things afresh. And you have to do a bit of digging. You have to go back to the older traditions to work out how to fill this out, because there isn't a kind of immediate cultural onslaught of Christianity that would try to satisfy those needs. And
Yes.
again, probably hooray for that, because that would come overloaded, overdetermined. Yeah, so look, your encounter at Cantor Cathedral, I feel for my friend David, and I shall make sure
Oh,
that
yeah.
he thinks that he's heard about this notion of what you encounter first, actually, because that might be actually very helpful to them. But
Uh,
it's also, it's the tension of our times that is maybe what we're trying to feel into. Can we make
yes.
contact again with something that has been sort of laid bare because of the
Yes.
withdrawal of cultural Christianity?
I good. Yeah, I'd love to have a chat with him at some point. What I felt, as I said, what it revealed to me actually was my own complicitness in this. Was that I myself rolled up? There was no burning bush. There were no shoes removed. There was nothing. I just turned up as a consumer, was met by consumerism, and was suitably affronted. But actually, it was a mirror of a kind. Now, I have two relatives you would probably find quite interesting in this conversation. I am the great 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 grandson of a man called John Porter, who was tortured to death for reading the Bible out loud in St. Paul's Cathedral. So he's an early kind of Protestant martyr, and he was taken down into a succession of dungeons over about a week, actually, and literally had the life luciferically squeezed out of him for to daring to speak scripture in a coherent, confident way, and in a language that the villagers and the townspeople understood. This was seen as dreadfully radical. So that is going on in me. It's literally in my bloodstream. My great great uncle is a man called Hamer Broadbent, who was traveled round Siberia, the Baltic states, Scandinavia, Poland in the very early parts of the 20th century, Plymouth Brethren, and predominantly working against what he called priestcraft, which was anything that was actually affecting the rights of indigenous cultures, getting in the way of how they actually functioned in a soulful and beautiful world. And so it doesn't take long for me to feel these ancestral characters grow up in me a little bit, which was why actually in my own immediate family, my move to orthodoxy was an interesting one, because there would be a fairly convincing argument that this really is not in your tradition, and why would you want it to be in your tradition? However, that comes back to your very first point today about participation, that actually, despite hierarchical patterning from a distance of the Orthodox Church, as is the case with most things in life. When you get in amongst it, there's a very different dynamic at play. And what is most at play for me is a living encounter. Now, actually, I come out predominantly really out of the charismatic movement. That's what I grew up in. And the charismatic movement, the edges of that tent would really start to shake on occasion. And as a middle-aged man, I'm not quite sure what it was, quite what that was. But what I can say is you did feel a profound sense of something thrilling and alive that had not had, was not Beckettian in its blood. It was not diluted. And irony of ironies for me, I think often in our own life, I've been thinking about the notion of Christ as the kinsman redeemer, and this old biblical notion that I think part of being a human is to take on certain abandoned responsibilities and shoulder them. You know, what ideas, what stories, what family members, in the case of Ruth and Naomi, what are you going to stand for? What are you going to look after? And there's a peculiar tension, I think, in my own life between the orthodoxy that I'm immersed in, but also the very Blakean awareness of the wonder of things that luckily you do get in the Desert Fathers and the Desert Mothers. You do get it, even, especially actually on some of the monastic stuff that comes out of Mount Athos. But again, if you mishear it or you're only exposed to a certain strata of it, it can seem like just yet more hair shirt asceticism.
I think another dynamic which I think is really important to me that I sense in what you're saying is being deeply informed by our forebears, and of course the forebears in the faith as well as our literal ancestors, but knowing that they're calling us, I think, from the future, not from the past. That's a deeply central Christian impulse. So the Bible begins in a garden, and many people, because of ecological concerns, are very keen on stressing that. It's absolutely true, but it does actually end in a new city, in the New Jerusalem, with waters flowing from that, and so that image is a kind of calling forth to something, and it's not a nostalgic rejection of the present. But I think this is deeply in Blake, actually, is that understanding the present moment, not just as straightforwardly fallen, which then it gets very easy to condemn and to critique and to dissemble, as you're saying, but to realize that the desires which are so active in the modern world, the desires to consume and so on, I think are a kind of perversion, or at least a sort of misfiring of a desire for God, for the infinite, that we have, because of the abundance of material things around us. It's so easy to feel that just by accumulating a few more finite things, you can nudge your way towards infinity. Whereas, of course, this fractal approach is to see a sacramental presence of the infinite in all the many things around us. So it's not wanting to possess them, but to contemplate them, you might say, or it's not wanting to accumulate more and more, but as Blake says, nothing less than the all can satisfy us. And so that I've been thinking about this in terms of how we educate our desires. So not trying to sort of discipline them in the sense of sort of suppress them, because I think that probably just leads to a spiral down, but realizing that they can be released into something else. But it does require, well, maybe two things, which I've heard you talk about and I think are very central. One is to keep front of mind this sense of search. I've heard you say that one of the things that you realized when you started talking about your becoming an Orthodox Christian is that people can love you when you're questing, but when you say you think you found something, there's a pulling back, and that's an awkward moment. But of course, I think that true Christianity is it's not about saying I've got it and this is what it is and you need to get it, and sort of sign on the dotted line. This rather transactional again notion of Christianity, which of course is very dominant in certain circles, but actually, no, I think I'm on the real quest now. It's just begun. It's a bit like in the Divine Comedy when Dante and Beatrice get to paradise and Dante turns to us as readers and says, look, we've been through hell, we've been through purgatory, but you know, actually, the journey's just beginning now. That was all some kind of preparation so that I'm ready now to really start to participate in these things of God. So it intensifies the quest, you might say, rather than somehow brings it to an end. I've said more than I thought about that, so let me just pass that back to you
Right.
and see whether that makes sense as a response to this feeling you've had about what happens when you say, look, I think I've found something.
Yes, yes. In a synopsis, I'm glad you've picked up on that, because for me that was a big moment. I just really said people love it when you're searching, but they hate it when you find something. Because searching is something that we can all kind of nod along to and say, yes, search for love, search for God if you absolutely must, search for treasure, search for status. In a way, searching is part of the temperament of the West. It's part of the deep down temperament of the West, and it has a tick attached to it. But what I found in the Christian experience was that actually the questing has not it hasn't ended. It's just deepened. And it's, again, forgive me, it's very familiar ground. I've spoken about this many times. It's the trading for exponential growth for very particular depth. I was listening to Tom Wright, NT Wright, talking recently, and someone asked him a question. They said, why is it, Mr. Wright, surely in the end, all religions are all pointing up the same mountain. They all kind of roughly mean the same thing. Can't we just sort of lean back in a kayak of oneness? And why do we have to do the Christian thing? Hasn't it sort of ceased? And he used a very sort of C.S. Lewis type of analogy. He said, well, this is Tom Wright's voice, well, if you were catching a train from Doncaster to Exeter, it may not be there. He said a lot of the journey would be awfully similar. You'd see the home counties, you'd see certain rivers and trees. It would be similar, but then there are diverging critiques, and it goes off in different areas. And the Christian journey has a very particular taste and flavor to it that the others may not share, just as Hinduism and others may not share that either. However, as people like David Bentley Hart have put a lot of effort into, there are all sorts of extraordinary commonalities. And those interfaith dialogues, actually, we owe Catholic theologians a lot in the 20th century. I remember once seeing a very well-known evangelical figure, Mark Driscoll, who I never really took to. And Driscoll said, what on earth would I have to learn from a Hindu? To a great sort of ripple of applause from his 4,000 strong child. And that made me shudder instantly. I found that ill-informed and ignorant. And whilst for me, no, I don't believe that all the roads lead to exactly the same place. I find that a bit gauche. I do understand those sort of connecting places.
Yeah, I mean, I actually do believe that all roads lead to the same place eventually. But the point is that it's all particular paths that lead to the universal. That's the nature of many finite things being embraced by the infinite. It's not that the finite
Yeah.
things become a kind of smudge that is virtually indistinguishable from each other, but that those many, many different things are as many expressions of this infinite presence, this infinite life, that is one but contains the myriad. And so, why wouldn't you expect the many paths to be very, very different, perhaps, because their goal is the one God. It's not just a kind of smudged cultural uniformity. And
Yeah.
there's another element in this, which I think is important in what you're saying, which is it's the notion of devotion. What are we going to give ourselves to? And you have to give yourself to something particular when you're a particular finite creature.
Yeah.
You can't, as it were, give yourself to an ideal. You have to work out where that ideal lands. And of course it lands as you put it in this beautiful way, of course, as you always do, somewhere sort of 3 foot outside your front door. That is the place where you're going to have to find what you want to give yourself to, what you want to devote yourself to. It's this thing that I'm thinking a lot about, feel very challenged by actually at my sort of time of life, which is about how death plays its part in this life. How clearly, death at the end of life, that's one thing that one feels increasingly, and you get aware that time is limited, as Jung put it so tellingly but so alarmingly. You get to a point where you realize the sun's past its zenith and it's now somewhere in the afternoon, and the sunset, you can almost feel it starting to approach. But of course that is a call to work out, as Blake put it, annihilate the selfhood in me. What are you going to give of your own life in order that you can participate in this wider life? And I think devotion is a kind of helpful. I'm finding it a helpful way to think about. For example, I am quite a spiritual consumer in a way. I have tried to find this mystical inner contemplative tradition elsewhere because it's so hard to find as a living thing within Christianity. And earlier this year, for example, I did a Vipassana retreat, which is this super intense, actually, 10-day Buddhist retreat that a lot of people are going on because it's demanding. But one of the things which I come away from with that is wanting my own devotional life to be part of this inner journey, so that meditation, contemplation is not a kind of, I don't know, sometimes they're even talked about as technologies of the mind, as if you can sort of reprogram yourself through meditative techniques. I don't think it's really about technique at all, although, learning how to sit in silence and leaning on the breath and so on is a handy skill to have. And, I wish I'd been taught that earlier in a way. But what I also noticed about this Vipassana retreat was that there was a lot of chanting that was going on. It was the chap that leads it, Goenka, doing the chanting in Sanskrit. We were sort of told, don't worry too much about the chanting, but I really worried more and more about the chanting, because I think I wanted to be in that space, participating in it with a devotional life alive as well. And devotional life, I think, has to be particular. Many other things do, no doubt, as well. But this figure of Jesus has to be part of my devotional life now. And, all the sort of specificity of that. It's a personal form of devotion. A lot of the Eastern traditions, they're very unsure about personal forms of devotion. They say that the one is impersonal, and I think there's a truth in that actually as well, in this infinite expanse. But I become increasingly clear that my particular calling has this personal quality and character. I think it is part of the distinctiveness of Western traditions, and we've got to go into that, I think, in order to work out how it relates to wider traditions. And, at a more personal level, I pray it enables me to give more of myself, because it's coming from the heart as well as from the mind and the psyche. So, yeah, something about the particular and devotional element, but also this, great challenge of what you're going to give yourself to, which, Jesus says many, many times, it's only when you lose your life that you find it. And whilst the promise is tremendous, the path to losing your life, it is frightening at times, as well as, a path that you kind of want to take at the same time, because you know that trying to hold on to your finite life doesn't really lead you anywhere anyway.
No, brilliant. I love your openness with that, Mark. That's so exciting to describe where you are, and it's so useful for people, rather than you just sort of downloading a creed on top of their head to say this is where I find myself. I was with a priest the other day, and the priest said to me, you know, he didn't say it with he wasn't disturbed. He just said it as an observation. He said, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that you're really bringing people into an encounter with orthodoxy. And my dad later said to me, he said, well, no, you're trying to bring people into an encounter with God. You know, orthodoxy is a wonderful thing, and anybody that knows me knows that that is the deep tradition of which I am currently being formed in. But when we gather, you, me, and others at Skinboat, that is not something I'm trying to sort of, the encounter is the thing. Everything comes from the encounter. Again, Joseph Campbell always said, be careful that you don't have a religion that is defending you against a religious experience. And so you talking now about your interest in the personal and that Jesus has to be part of that iconic relationship that you're having, that for me is very telling in my own interest in place. So one of the things, again, that used to kind of wash me out a bit as a youngster was being continually told about the Great Commission and how Christianity all over the world, it's just this great universal thing that we can all kind of latch into as if it was easy. However, what we do know about Christianity is as soon as it grows roots anywhere, it does take on a regional flavor. Regionality, nationalism is the great shadow in orthodoxy. It is the potential great abiding sin of it, that it is such a strong regional thumbprint. It doesn't have enough of the universal about it on occasion, not always. But what I am interested in, I can't help but be interested in, is what would the story of Genesis look like if it happened on Dartmoor? What would it happen if it looked right where I lived? Because of course it did. It did. As a mythologist, I would be cutting off my own intelligence not to follow that kind of associative road. So with my own students, I'm always saying, you know, walk out into the fullness of a Blakean dawn and pay attention to what is continually announcing itself to you. Any encounter with God robs you of the illusion of scarcity, But an encounter with God can be tremendously subtle, and you have to give yourself permission in a way to go, wow, my encounter with God happened in a conversation at the greengrocer's. It happened, you can't see this, but 2 foot away is my very, very ancient cat, Harry. And I have encounters with God looking into the eyes of Harry. It is, I don't worship Harry, but these pinpricks of the eternal, this overused phrase that I tend to come up with, there's something about that. And to go back again, I think when things start to fall apart, I think when Christianity loses its political oomph, I can only breathe a sigh of relief because something real may announce itself. And it is still, for me, the great, extraordinary, ancestral kayak, as I said, to sort of fall. It's the kayak of my people. It's the kayak of my people. I've said before, again, it's not an original thought, really. The first half of our lives, thinking about death, the first half of our lives generally it has a chameleon quality where we are trying to adapt to circumstances we find ourselves in, a new school, a new relationship. And then midlife, where, God willing, you're beginning to become a mentor to others. And then finally, if you live long enough, something of an elder. That is no longer the putting on of personas, but the emerging of presence. And mercifully for me, in the velocity of exposure that Christianity has undignified me with, it's the most undignified experience I've ever had, and I needed it. In that, I find for the first time, slowly, my own experience of death, whether that is 2 years away or 40 years away, I have no clue. I find simply resting in the mind of Christ extremely reassuring in that moment. I imagine our life is similar in the sense of most people in their 50s and upwards. I'm going to a lot of memorials, a lot of funerals. I'm holding hands with people as they are dying, and better people than me will find that probably blissful. I find it shattering. I find it shattering to see someone that I knew as a big, warm, ebullient personality, little more than a skeleton in a pair of pajamas, crumpled up on a bed, smelling of death. You know, that is not revealed to us in the West as it is on the River Ganges. So part of me at the moment is taking that. When I go to sleep at night, I sort of fall asleep into God. I know it sounds odd, as I'm drifting into unconsciousness. That's the way, because I'm practicing. Because there'll come a point, if I'm given the consciousness that I will know is dimming, I want to somehow remember I've been here before and allow myself more fully into eternity.
Yeah. The parallel that I'm finding very helpful at the moment is one of the great works of the Western Christian tradition, which is the Cloud of Unknowing. And
Yes.
there's this wonderful word in the Middle English that it has, which is about being wand with God. And it's an active present participle, because it's about realizing what's already the case rather than somehow having to hope that one will be wand with God. And the Cloud of Unknowing is this place that we stand from and look towards the divine, where we realize the sort of limits of our knowing, our comprehension, but also discover that our longing, our love, again, this is the devotional aspect that's speaking to me so much at the moment, can reach into that cloud. Kind of, love's like that. It can sort of see around corners, that then reason and knowledge tries to catch up with a bit. But it's from that place of being stripped bare, that which is in a way only divine could approach one. And I'm finding it a very brilliant text. I mean, people have found it a brilliant text ever since it was written by its author. But because it feels to me like, again, it's got a message for our times, when it's so easy in life to feel you can sort of prop your life up. You can maintain some level of control. The accumulation of things makes life more comfortable, and that I'm not about to easily give all that up. But nonetheless, in the act of contemplation, to know that they all risk becoming idols, but putting them to one side, as Meister Eckhart put it as well, another great Western mystic, it's about locating the uncreated in you, that which is of God, and seeing how that can get obscured by what's created, which is good, because in another moment, the Blakean moment, what's created then is full of the uncreated as well, and life, as it were, is completely renewed, and turned around. But I think that, well, the Indian philosophy would say you need the Vedantic moment when you withdraw, and know purely of the divinity. And then there's the tantric moment, which is the return to see that all things are full of this divinity that now you are a bit clearer about, and so can orientate around, and be less seduced by the idols, the artifice, because you know that they too are in the service of the divine life. So Bernard McGinn, actually, the great writer about mysticism, one of his points, which I really like, is that, kind of challenged by the Eastern traditions, he's saying the Western too have their own traditions of theosis and being wand, and I think part of the imperative of this rediscovery of Christianity is to bring that back to the fore, and figures like Blake and others are so valuable in that.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. Now, there's a quote, you'll know who quoted it, but somebody said, some point in the last 100 years, probably, if Christianity even has half a chance, we all have to be mystics. So who was that?
Yes, that's Karl
Remember?
Rahner. Yeah, if it's something like, if there's going to be a Christianity of tomorrow, it will be a mystical Christianity, or there'll be no
Yeah,
Christianity at all.
yeah.
And
I
he,
am
he's like
you know,
mainstream big shot Vatican II Roman Catholic theologian, so he's not some marginal figure having a conversation across YouTube.
yes, yes, exactly right. Well, to my bones, I would have a mystic temperament. I had it when I was 2 years old, and I have it now at 53. And I would concur with that. I'm very careful. The word mystic, of course, in more New Age circles carries a lot of inflation with it. So I'm careful not to sort of announce myself in that way. I have here's a sort of a little twist is talking about marginal figures on YouTube having a conversation. That is part of what is happening at the moment, and the Russell Brands, the Jordan Petersons, etc. I mean, Russell Brand seems to have gone down a fairly sort of straightforwardly evangelical road, as far as I can tell. I don't know the guy, and this all, in my mind and consciousness, really begins with Tom Holland in a way, and with Dominion, and it just opening and doors opening all over the place. We've got Nick Cave in discourse with Rowan Williams and things like that. I've got to be honest, although I can see the problem areas in it in terms of what we've called vertical rather than horizontal Christianity, civic Christianity rather than mystical, I would rather it was there than nothing at all, because I've lived through very, very arid decades where it was not regarded as even intellectually stimulating enough to be talked about. I would hope that these conversations are not the end destination of a religious inquiry from a watcher. But I have to say, in my own little chapel, my own little Orthodox church, we have this influx of what we call catechumen, which are young people, actually, in this case, don't have to be young, but people wanting to become Orthodox. And if you ask them, why are you putting yourself through the rigors of this particular discipline? They say two things. One is, it's a Christianity that actually is asking something from me, and I want something to be asked from me. And secondly, I first heard about this through Mark Vernon or Jonathan Peugeot or even Jordan Peterson. So sometimes we just have to be gatekeepers and keep our fingers crossed. You know that there's much sort of helium in the air, that, all technology is essentially sort of corrupted and luciferic. Well, if that was the case, that gives a Christian a wonderful opportunity for subversive acts of beauty, doesn't it? Just keep putting beautiful, expansive, warm, invitational ideas into the machine. That's my sort of immediate response to it. Plus, I'm a believer in what you would call the pharmacon, really, which is the remedy and the poison. I'm not really one for saying, oh, if we got rid of all of this, everything would be okay, and we live in this sort of, Amish hinterland. I'm not made like that. But I think we do have to proceed with caution. One of the things storytellers do is they protect their imagination, because it is the imagination that gets you to be able to tell the Odyssey for 5 days from one end to the other. And if you allow too much stimulus from the outer world, it's why many storytellers that are great are blind. That's why they're blind. Homer, for example, there's usually been a price afforded in your life early on that has limited your gaze. And in the limiting of the gaze comes the exfoliation of the story. And that is something that I would be aware of in terms of I sometimes feel that the devil's got into my retinas when I've been endlessly doom scrolling, and I got and I'm very easily fooled. There was a little video the other day on my phone of a little dog being adopted by a duck. Its mother had died, the little dog, and the duck, it travels around. It all looks like it looks like Super 8 film. It looks completely real. And I sent it to my daughter, who's at university. I said, "Isn't this the most wonderful story?" And she says, "Dad, you're an idiot. This is AI. None of this is real. None of this is real." And even in 18 months, ANI is now so accelerated and so convincing. I was swept along by it immediately. And then I thought, well, the sentiment of the thing is still beautiful, so I'm not going to judge myself for having a tenderized heart. But on the other hand, yeah, it is difficult what we're being presented with. I was talking to the actor Mark Rylance fairly recently, and Mark was saying to me now how in future contracts with actors, they will have to negotiate the AI virtual version of themselves being potentially sold or flogged for films that will be made long after they're not even on the earth.
Yeah. There's a lot happening, and that's why maybe the temptation to be reactive to it is so strong. But I'm very much liking your sense of releasing some joy into the machine. Maybe it's releasing
Yes.
some spirit into the machine, and
Yeah.
constantly monitoring in a way the energy that one is invoking, because I think that there is interest and excitement around what a lot of these figures that you're mentioning, and that I watch too, um, you know um, even the Jordan Petersons and Russell Brands, although mostly it's now to wonder quite what's gone wrong. I do confess, but there's perhaps a learning even in that, which is uh, I don't know. I'm. This is a very sort of a large character to invoke in a Christian context, but in the earliest references to the Antichrist, I think in the letters of Peter, it's always said that the Antichrist looks almost exactly like Christ. And I think there's a deep truth
Yeah.
in that, which is that that which is false is so powerful because it's almost true. And it's not just that someone is mistaken, but that they're really genuinely looking for the truth. But it gets this little twist or this nudge. It's in the name of Lucifer that the angel of light, Lucifer, is the one that falls, not just some random bad guy, if you like, who doesn't really have very far to fall anyway. So, when people turn to different figures to try and feel into these things, discerning the spirits that's in the machine is
Yeah.
really, really important. And asking just very basic questions, actually. There's nothing fancy about this, but is this basically good news? Is this, as the Jesuits would say, is this consoling of the soul rather than desolation? And it's very
Yeah.
much what I like in your work too, because it feels like the effort which you're putting in to tell these biblical stories afresh, to recover something of the spirit that's present in them now, rather than say telling them as, I don't know, the ammunition that a civilization needs to defend itself against the encroachment of your enemy of choice, or even uh, you know, reaching too quickly for a kind of Christianity that feels like it can build walls against a perceived threat. And I think this is where Christianity so quickly reduces to a kind of moral Christianity. It's like we're given our marching orders. We must give this up. We must curb that desire. We must stop this thing happening, protest against that. I've no doubt there's a place for that. I fought my culture wars in my time as well, but I think too, what more important is to make sure that we're holding this space of possibility, and it's an active holding. It's this questing that is renewed, and so your efforts to now build in Christian story into your extraordinary capacity to tell stories that, as you say, the oral storyteller, part of what they bring is that they are telling the story as it's coming to them in the moment. And there's something really important in that the heart of Christianity is the notion of incarnation, but it's not actually something that happened 2,000 years ago primarily, although I think it did. That just signaled that this is the continual presence and activity of God in us. That the genius of the human creation is that in a particular way, the divine can be born in us, and we can try and find the words to express that. We can try and find the means of celebrating that, and because we're in at least some significant measure free, it can go horribly wrong as well. So anyway, look, that's leaping all over the place now, but discerning the spirit that's being released, I feel is really a fundamental task. And holding open this space of possibility rather than reaching too quickly for the solutions that somehow, and I understand it, we feel we need.
Yes, I love that though, the joy in the machine. Because obviously we all know that the machine is an idea, as a philosophical idea, has been going back a long time, even before Schopenhauer and the decline of the West. It goes back to back and back and back. Going back, I think in the decline possibly of too much political Christian heft, although we will see this in the election in the next few days in America and how much that gets leaned on there. But it's when an act of love is replaced by an act of will. When an act of love is replaced by an act of will, and the will centers in humans are easy to activate, especially with a bit of fear, boosted into the mix. It stimulates the adrenals. And I think will activation is part of the success story of Christianity as much as the message, because I think we've done a very, very mixed job of actually transmitting the message, because the message is, as I said, almost counterintuitive to the building of a nation state. It really is. Any of us get any near where what Jesus is really talking about. Most of us get the heebie-jeebies fairly quickly. He's hanging out with people we don't want to hang out with, and he's asking from us things we simply do not want to do. There's not many of us want to empty our bank accounts and just take to the street. And also we are uncomfortable with the fact that Jesus was a hands-on healer. He was an exorcist. He's living in a world that seems very, very different to us now, but that's only different in the first world. If you go to the third world, if you go to parts of the globe that have not been stretched on the rack of technology in the way that we have, there's more of a Jesus-shaped consciousness there. And I wonder sometimes if that's because of the rapid expansion of Christianity is not often in the West anymore. It's in other places, like Africa, for example. There's a kind of recognition to it. But to summarize again, it's the difficult love that Christ invites, not just, as I said, an act of will, of sticking my staff in the ground, of announcements which immediately are meant to be medicinal, but are really a form of calcification and protection against my own God-given curiosity. Yeah, and that is what the Skimbo is all about.
Yeah, there's a lot of love active in these weekends, and it is the love of curiosity, the yearning love that one feels drawing oneself towards this promise. And again, I think love can mean many things as well, and a love that quickly becomes a kind of moral imperative. One ought to do this. I think is a narrow kind of love. Sometimes we need to have that cajoling, but a love that can see over horizons, that is this power of allure that we are asked to be, I think, active in response, but to attend primarily to that which we're responding to. I'm trying to find the sort of the right way of putting it. I mean, Rowan Williams, he sometimes puts it like this. He says, it's so easy for Christians to go around all the time, as if sort of, he doesn't quite put it like this actually, but sort of as functional atheists, by which he means it's as if Christians assume that they've got to put everything right, rather than discerning the presence of God, the presence of the Spirit, in the most unlikely of places. I mean, I think that, I like Paul's expression about being in the world but not of the world. And it feels to me that is very much a wonderful summary of Jesus's life. That in a way there was nowhere where he wouldn't go, and that meant going, amongst the poor and amongst the leprous and so on. But it also meant being, with the tax collectors and accepting the alabaster jar
Yeah.
poured across his feet that was worth so much. But constantly, wherever you are, trying to discern where the kingdom is near, where God is breaking through. So
Lovely.
not trying to get sort of too prescriptive ahead of time, because that that is quite easy, but rather that this harder quest, which is being in the world but not of the world. That I think in the biblical stories, that's what caused people to be surprised about Jesus. Actually, when he's has the woman caught in adultery brought to him, and his opponents by then, very much geared up, say, what are we supposed to do with this person, hoping that Jesus is going to judge her, to condemn her. He causes them to be surprised by working out how to judge her so as to liberate her. It's a kind of both and response. Or when they bring the coin to him and it's got Caesar's head on it, and he says, give to Caesar that which is Caesar's and God that which is God's. He says in the Bible, it says, they were amazed at his response. That's not the reaction you get just from a kind of neat resolution of a solution, but it's the reaction you get when you realize a whole other possibility is breaking in here. That the world that we thought lies before us, it does, but also it brings a whole other perception of reality as well. And that's the love that I'm looking for, I think, that can hold me to that.
Yes. One of the really wonderful things that I feel that you highlighted in your book on secret Christianity was that actually the parables of Jesus were never ever designed to slip down easily. They weren't meant to do that. They were meant to instigate what I've described in my own life as a kind of protracted nervous breakdown of conventional logic. That's what's been going on for me the last 3 years. I have a group of friends, just contemporaries of mine, and we gather often on a Wednesday evening, and we work our way through the Gospels in a very undidactic sense of just saying, what is alive for you in this? What is troubling your soul into communication? And one of the things was that the stark strangeness of these little bitty wild stories with all their kind of agricultural and fishing references, because Jesus knows his audience like a good storyteller. He knows the analogies that are going to land, but he by no means, these actually can't be written on a kind of Facebook emoji page. They're not very platitudinal. They're difficult, odd stories. Well, I don't want someone that gets paid in the last hour of the day to get paid what I got paid when I've been working 8 hours. That's just not fair. The not fairness is nothing Jesus ever seems particularly concerned with for me. And if you want a straight answer, he's not the teacher for you. Not really. He usually walks us around and does all sorts of things with us. And actually, as a mythologist, as a storyteller, the stories, their very language is sparser, harder, stranger than the fulsomeness that I would get wandering through A Midsummer Night's Dream or through Homer. Or it doesn't offer me, actually, it's not like getting into a warm bath. I don't sit there. It's not the equivalent of sort of puffing on a cigar with a whiskey in a warm bath. I'm out in the desert with this strange crow that is walking around me that I can't quite see, this crow being just saying things that are devastating me, but my mind can't quite catch up with it. And then, of course, that leads to what I call the fundamental poetic event of my life, which is the crucifixion. The crucifixion was just never explained to me well enough to comprehend it. I had to have a series of dreams that actually just opened that door. And from that point onwards, for 6 months, I couldn't get anywhere. If anyone asked me about the Christian journey I was on, I had to be very careful, because I would weep uncontrollably. And as a middle-aged guy, what on earth is going on? This isn't just some some sort of philosophical toy that I'm playing with. I'm inconsolably sorrowful, and I have no rational explanation for that. Luckily, I've just about mopped myself up now, so I can function in public. But there was an appropriate derangement for a while that I will never fully understand.
Yeah. Well, that's that's the cusp of transformation, I guess. That's where that which is bubbling up meets that which has already settled down, and stirring it all up again. And you won't need me to tell you about Evagrius Ponticus and the gift of tears and all that. But on the other hand, it's also quite handy to be able to stand up in front of a group of people and give a coherent account of a
Yeah,
story
it is.
and an exploration of these
Yeah,
things. So hooray for that too. I'm glad that that's happening so wonderfully. Hey, look, maybe that's a point to draw to a close. I think we've been talking for a little while, and you know, these dialogues are so valuable because the third thing, can be felt. I think, I hope, and with people listening in as well, that the two of us, others, are reaching towards something that, it's beyond us all, but calls us all to. So it's really wonderful to try and do that in real time, because that is the present moment in which these things stay alive. So look, Martin, wonderful to speak again. Thanks so much for all you're doing, and know that there's lots of people who are not just gaining from it, but are really with you in it as well, and sensing the importance of these things as well as the love of them.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark. And also, just to remind folks that if you're listening to us talking and thinking about the skin boat and are excited by it, the dates for next year are not out yet. My website, schoolofmyth.com, very easy to remember. But have a look fairly soon. Next year's set of dates will be up. It will begin in September. So if you want to join us, there should be a space, but the places tend to go quite quick.
It's a wonderful gathering of people. So, Martin, I look forward to seeing you next time.
Yeah, see you soon, my friend. Bye-bye.